question 7 from paper 2 of the 2017 AS biology paper. And to answer this question, you really need to make sure that you know your antigen antibody terminology and that you're not getting confused with variable regions and active sites. It seems, according to the examiner's report, lots of students used enzyme terminology when in essence they mean the same thing, but they only belong with enzymes. So the question starts with NMO is a disease that leads to damage to nerve cells in the spinal cord. And a person with NMO produces anti-AQP4 antibody that attacks only these nerve cells. Explain why the anti-AQP4 antibody only damages these cells. So straight away, we're talking about an antibody. We're talking about a protein, we're talking about shape, we're talking about complementary, and we're talking about a variable region. And these are all the kind of terms that we want to get into our answer. So we're going to say that the antibody has a specific tertiary structure. And that's where we get our first mark. And we're straight into A level there because we're talking about tertiary structure that wasn't part of the GCSE. Then we need to say for the second mark, its variable region is only complementary to one antigen. Again, A-level content, because we're talking about variable regions. These are the regions of the antibodies that vary from one antibody to the other. For the third mark, we're going to say this antigen is found on these nerve cells. So we're going to check back to the stem of the question, which asks us to explain why the antibody only damages these cells. And we've done that. We've said that the antibody has a specific shape that only fits the antigen, and the antigen is sitting on the nerve cell. So all we're left to say is that the antibody forms a complex with the antigen, and it's that complex that damages the nerve cells. So as I mentioned lots of times before, do make sure that as you move through the question, you highlight and underline various parts of the question, because NMO is a disease, it's not a pathogen, and according to the examiner's reports, lots of students got confused there, and that was just pure poor reading of the question. And also not to confuse the variable region with the idea of the active site. Again, it's the same idea, but active site is a term that we only use when we're referring to enzymes. Next part of the question says scientists measured the concentration of the antibody in the blood with people with NMO. And the spinal cord is surrounded by small bones called vertebrae, we know that. For each person, the scientists also determined the number of vertebrae surrounding the damaged nerve cells. Their results are shown in figure 7. Now, looking at that straight away, I can only see 20 results on there. If I count the dots, there are 20. 20 people in a study seems quite small. Let's read on. A scientist suggested that the concentration of the antibody in a person's blood could be used to predict the number of vertebrae surrounding damaged nerve cells they are likely to have. Use figure 7 to suggest reasons why this suggestion might not be valid, and there are 3 marks. So that's my first answer. There were only 20 people in the study. Secondly, I'm going to say that for some concentrations of antibody, there was a range of the number of vertebrae surrounding damaged nerve cells. And if you look on the graph there, I've circled the results for some of them. So, for example, at a concentration of antibody of about 170, you could have had the number of vertebrae of 3, 4 or 5 surrounding the damaged nerve cells. And likewise, at a concentration of around 140, there were 4 vertebrae or 5 vertebrae surrounding the nerve cells. So you would find it very difficult to predict the number of vertebrae surrounding the damaged nerve cells. And then, of course, we can say that there was no statistical test used, and also the correlation is really weak. The bunching together of those results are really quite broad, so that's how we would describe that correlation. Moving on to the last part of the question, a new treatment for NMO involves using a monoclonal antibody. The structure of the variable region of this monoclonal antibody is identical to the variable region of the anti-AQP4 antibody, but the rest of the structure is different. So use this information and your knowledge of antigen-antibody complexes to suggest how this monoclonal antibody prevents the anti-AQP4 from damaging nerve cells. So in answer to this question, we know that the monoclonal antibody is going to bind to the nerve cell antigen. So that means that less or no anti-AQP4 can bind to the antigen itself. And so clearly, if the monoclonal antibody binds to it, it doesn't cause the nerve cell any damage. And of course, that was the mark that most people didn't get. They were able to explain how the antigen-antibody complex formed, but they weren't taking the answer full circle to then say that when the monoclonal antibody bound with the antigen on the nerve cell, it didn't cause any damage. And of course, for this question, remember not to use enzyme terminology. Again, earlier we talked about not using the word active site when we meant variable region, and it's the same in this case because a lot of students started writing about a competitive inhibitor, but that term belongs to enzymes and not antibodies. Even if it was correct in principle, we wouldn't use that terminology. I do hope the video has been of use. Thanks for watching, and if you can leave me a comment, that would be great.